Let's find out what Alistair Schultz from acysecurities is watching as we inch closer to the start of this Tuesday session. Alistair, welcome. We had a bit of a mixed performance out on Wall Street overnight. Those big tech names seeing a bit of pressure coming through. So do you think that will translate through to our market here in the tech names listed in Australia?
Good morning. Look, when it comes to the two industries, when we look at the tech side and the S&P 500, and then what we look at stuff here in Australia, they are very, very different markets. You know, we don't have the mega cap sort of performance that we see in the US sort of situation, and a lot of the income that we sort of do see here is still derived from some of those mega caps because of their globalized nature. So I'm not anticipating it to have the same sort of detrimental effects that we've seen overnight. However, I am interested in seeing how they do perform, especially considering, we've just gotten the rest of our earnings season for the US and we're basically at the end of it now, but we've still got a number of weeks to go coming up.
Well, from that perspective, we ourselves here at home have a lot to come on the earnings side of things. Lots of names already reported this morning, but has it generally been a pass mark or even in some cases a commendation mark from the names reporting over in the US until now?
Well, look, when it comes to that, I'm actually strongly surprised by what the sort of results have been. Looking back, before earnings season sort of started, we had this estimation that, we might be lucky if we saw 50% of the companies actually offering their earnings reports. And in fact, we've actually gotten nearly 90. So that on its own is just, dumbfounding to me, but also phenomenal in their reporting incidences. From that, 58% have actually increased in their expectations, or at least what was expected from them to come out. Most of us were expecting to see some bad stuff happening, but a lot of them have surpassed that and actually ended up with some quite good results. So is that a sign of, an earlier recovery than anticipated? Potentially. Is there some level of stimulus going into it? Of course there is. So I think at this point in time, it's sort of balancing out and weighing up those factors of how much stimulus is really involved in this, how much of it is driven by sort of speculators, and how much of it is not artificial. That is something to really consider over the next coming weeks.
Yeah, Alistair, I'm curious to get your current thinking on speculators, on day traders, and how they are potentially impacting markets, particularly in the United States.
Well, when you look at the cases like you see from Robinhood, even here in Australia, ASIC reported something like 30 times the average trading day volume for some of the highest days we saw in 2019 compared to 2020. So just from that, it indicates how many people have really entered the market just recently. And you'd have to assume that the majority of them are probably not professional investors or at least sophisticated, and a lot would be jumping on the bandwagon. And evidence to suggest this is things like we've seen recently just with Kodak. We've obviously had the Hertz situation where people are investing in bankrupt companies. So that side of the speculators market really is driving an increase in prices. And it's also evident when you see the counter side to that. When something sort of goes wrong in a company or the earnings result hasn't been quite as expected, you do see a lot of people bailing out more quickly than what you usually would. You'd usually see a little bit of people holding onto that position and hoping for a little bit of a better day the next day. But instead, the moment we do start to see a little bit of a drop, it sort of tumbles quite quickly.
Yes, certainly so. We learned today that Hertz sold $29 million worth of stock before the SEC stepped in. It's extraordinary, amazing times, considering it had filed for Chapter 11. What else is on your radar when it comes to the U.S. earnings season? We have been talking about, getting across this valley, investors being willing to look through what's happening now in the absence of any real meaningful guidance. Is that how things played out primarily in the U.S.?
I think one of the things to sort of keep in mind when it comes to stock markets in general is that they're not a reflection of the current economy. They're a reflection of what the optimistic side. You can almost look at it as a barometer of optimism in this idea that people are sort of looking to see what might happen in the near future. So it's the expectations for the economy in 12 months' time or even further down the track. Now, is that necessarily the right way to think? Well, that's how markets have kind of always sort of operated, but more so these days with this speculators-driven market. We're seeing it a lot more in that case and probably a little bit exaggerated in my view. I think overall, realistically, the thoughts are that are coming in. We're starting to see some of these vaccines come into play. There's 3 in stage 3 trials, and there is a lot of optimism around that because the moment we do get that vaccine come out, then it's likely to occur in some pretty good results for the rest of the global economy. But what does that mean for the stock side of things as well? And that's something that I have been thinking about a lot recently, if you were to have, say, no vaccine go out, then we'd likely see the same sort of behaviors that we're seeing right now, where it tends to be focused on the tech stocks that are focused on, the cloud services and the e-commerce side of things, and obviously the biotech industry with health services. But if we were to see the other side of that, where everyone's been pooling their funds into safe havens and been worried about what the actual impact is really going to be on some of the ones that they're uncertain about, then we're likely going to see them sort of flood away from those safe havens like gold. And even though bonds are not really the big thing right now, eventually they might again be. Either way, it's going to be a very different dynamic to what we're seeing today. So I think on both sides, whether there's a vaccine, whether there's not a vaccine, it's going to be an interesting case to see what happens in the very near future.
I guess you said it as well, Alistair, because a lot about what the equity markets are pricing is what's next. So if people are thinking there might be a vaccine, how much of this do you think might be baked in? So even if we do have this vaccine come through, have we seen a lot of that positivity already reflected in prices globally?
I don't actually think we have. When you look at the cases of like Moderna Incorporated and AstraZeneca and things like that, when they have had reports about positive vaccine news, their stock prices have obviously gone up, and quite quickly. But when you compare that to what we're seeing in the tech side of things, the profits and the revenue just aren't the same. So there is a little bit of concern. And I'm a bit of a pessimist when it comes to a vaccine. I've done a little bit of research on the idea that, coronaviruses have been around for a long time. We've been trying to get a vaccine for nearly 20 years. So whilst there is more budget, more focus, and obviously the attention with 5 million cases in the US alone, there's obviously a very dire need for a vaccine to come along. But whether they're able to successfully, replicate something or get something happening very quickly is a very different story. I think I was reading an article just the other day that was saying that some of the tier one banking elements were looking at this idea of fastening up their timeline for when a vaccine might actually turn around. I still think that you look at the stages of trials and how much goes into it. 30% of your entities that hit these phase 2 clinical trials still don't make it through. 70% in phase 1 basically stall out there. So to get them past phase 3 and into the phase 4 human trial era, it's a long task to go, and it takes time to come along. So regardless of that, those medical restrictions are there for a reason, and that is going to be something that they're going to have to contend with down the track.
Okay, just quickly, Alistair, we've got the XJO sitting above that 6,100 level, 6,110 in fact. It was a pretty stellar session yesterday, all things considered. What are you expecting today?
I'm not expecting to see too much change around that today. I think we'll likely, if we are going to see any movement, it'll just sort of retrace around a little bit and have a bit of a breather. We are still waiting on some news to see where they go from in the next couple of weeks. So I think waiting for the rest of this week's earnings season will really play a big part for us on that.
Okay, looking forward to it all. Alistair Schultz from ACY Securities in Sydney. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks for having me.